electricity for our lives to function. Without it, how do we charge our phones or toast our bread to go with our coffee in the morning? So as the first step, we need to do a high-level summary of the energy sector before we can then dive into how it works. I think it's important we first understand how the WA electrical grid is owned and operated. And I'm here today with Damien and Scott to help us dive into that issue. So my first question is probably to you, Damien. How does the energy sector work?
Thanks, Lana. When we're talking about energy, we're talking about electricity and gas. So with relation to electricity, it's generated via coal, gas, solar and wind, and we just found out recently that the coal is to be phased out by 2029, which is very interesting. That generation is then distributed to through an electrical network owned and operated by Western Power. And they are the poles and the wires and the substations that distribute that energy, generally to the boundary of somebody's property, whether it's the residential or private or business sector. When it comes to gas, the gas is piped down from the northwest shelf and then is distributed via a network, underground network, to our homes and our businesses, and that's a privately owned energy network, gas network.
Okay, so do those operators sell us the energy?
No, they don't. We have multiple entities that are licensed to sell electricity and gas, and those and they're referred to as retailers, energy retailers, and they can sell both electricity and gas to an end consumer like a business or a residency.
Okay, so now that we understand the framework around the operation of utility provision, how does this relate to the buildings that we live and work in, Damien? What components make up a building's electrical infrastructure?
Okay, that word infrastructure is a really boring word, and I'm sorry we have to use it a lot. But unfortunately, it really explains the assets that are owned within a premises. So we're talking a transformer, we're talking switchboards, distribution boards, panels, meters, the cabling that runs between the switchboards all the way into people's premises or through the building, and also some renewable assets as well, like solar panels, inverters, batteries, and for future electric vehicle chargers.
Okay, and who owns this electrical infrastructure that you've just talked about?
Okay, so as I mentioned, Western Power owns the cables and the poles and the wires to the premises, to the boundary, and then within the property, the scheme or the landlord owns those assets, those infrastructure assets. But in some instances, that's not quite the case.
All right, and who actually sends me my bill?
Well, that one's actually probably for me. This is where I guess it gets a little bit more complex. Western Power, in most circumstances, would own the meters, and they then would provide on the data. But effectively, there's three main scenarios. There's the Western Power owned meters scenario. Then there's the scheme owned meters, and the scheme actually owns the meters and provides that data, and we often might refer to that as an embedded network. And then there's the third scenario, which is where the scheme might part own some of that electrical infrastructure, which Damien's just spoken about, and then a third party might own other elements of that electrical infrastructure, namely the metering, and they would then provide that electrical data to the scheme.
So, Scott, can you explain more about Western Power?
So, as Damien described under the electrical infrastructure, Western Power own the majority of the electrical infrastructure up to the property boundary, but they also own the meters within the property under the Western Power ownership model. So Western Power will come in and read the meters, and then they will provide that data onto Synergy. And Synergy will then on-bill the consumer or the lot that's consuming the energy and send them their bill. The state government determines a gazetted rate, and the A1 residential rate is the tariff that generally applies to our residential schemes, and the cost average is around about 33 cents per kilowatt for the A1 residential consumption. The A1 tariff rate encompasses the cost for the retailer to be able to read the data and provide the costs, including the Western Power meter reading costs.
Okay. And is that the same on the eastern seaboard?
No, on the eastern seaboard, the energy price is completely unregulated, and it isn't controlled like it is over here by our state government. Over on the eastern seaboard, they have a default market, and while the state governments can try to influence where that pricing structure is, the energy retailers will take that lead from state government, but then they will factor in any uncertainty they might have. And that's what we're experiencing at the moment, is that uncertainty around coal prices, gas prices, the war in Ukraine, and how that's influencing the energy sector. So they're factoring that in when they set their energy prices, and that's why we've suddenly seen this skyrocketing prices on the eastern seaboard, and now the federal government stepped in to help put a freeze on it and control it a little bit more.
Right. And what about here in WA?
So yeah, as we said, WA the energy price is completely regulated by the state government. So you cannot charge above the tariff rate. So this is where if you look to move away from a Western Power owned metership structure, there are potentially opportunities where you can go to the open retail sector and get a more competitive price, and then either provide a cheaper price of electricity to the consumer, or still charge at the A1 tariff and use some of that income to offset the cost that the scheme experiences. But we explore that a bit more further, or a bit further under part 3 of this series.
Excellent. So, Damien, under the 3 scenarios, how does the complete scheme ownership work?
Sure. This is often referred to also as an embedded network. Under this model, the scheme owns the electrical and gas infrastructure, and they often engage specialist billing service providers to do the reading for the scheme. That's usually done for a fee for service. The scheme buys the electricity for the entire site from a licensed electricity retailer, and that's usually under a contract arrangement. And energy specialists can assist with that, so you get the best energy pricing. And this means that at an embedded network or a complete ownership structure, that a single utility gate meter, which is the Western Power meter, is positioned at the front of the premises at the entry of the electricity into the building. And that's recording the entire consumption of the entire premises. In WA, we're lucky that Western Power, the network operator, owns these meters, because on the eastern states, the electricity retailer owns them. So when you change retailers, you've got to change meters. And that's a much more complex process and issue. So our structure is much simpler here and much sounder as a result. So each individual lot has a sub-meter in most cases. There actually are some examples where that's not the case, and you can't actually measure, they have to average it instead. And most people much prefer a user pays methodology where you know that you're paying for what you consume, and that's where, if it's metered properly, that's the case. And the data from these meters, which are read on a cyclic basis, either monthly or bi-monthly, are collected, and that's what's utilised to prepare the electricity account for that individual lot. And to ensure billing accuracy, it's also a valuable process to reconcile the energy of the property, because you've got the main incoming supply, most of which goes to the lots or tenants, and but other portions go to other services like swimming pools, pool pumps, heaters, air conditioning systems for common services and the like. So that needs to be allocated properly as well.
Yeah, and this is, I guess, where the standard Schedule 1 Bylaw 3 helps schemes on bill the cost of utility and recover it. Unfortunately, that bylaw is often inadequate because it doesn't factor in all the elements of the cost of delivering that utility. For electricity, that doesn't factor in the third party reading costs that you might have. and it might not factor in other administration costs. So under that situation, I think it's important that schemes review those bylaws and arguably add a more comprehensive bylaw that allows them to really capture the full cost of provision of a utility, remembering that the actual kilowatt rate can't exceed the A1 tariff rate. And there's a lot of benefits around that because ultimately the scheme also becomes a little bit of party to providing that energy to the lot consumer.
Scott, what about the third ownership scenario that you mentioned?
Well, in some instances, the developer at the time the scheme is being developed may engage with a third party to help offset some of the costs when it comes to the utility provisions within the scheme, and also just to provide some framework around on how that might work. So when he's selling the apartments, the owners are aware how that element within the building will be managed. So the third party will come in and fund generally the metering and own the meters. But they might also come in and put in the solar. They might install the batteries. They might also do EV charging. They also might extend their provision to the scheme above just electricity and gas and may include air conditioning, and they may even provide the air conditioning plant, and they might even provide the hot water, and therefore they might also provide the hot watering plant to the scheme.
Okay, great. And Damien, can you tell us a bit more about the third party ownership that Scott mentioned?
Sure. These third parties may also be a licensed energy retailer, so they may actually hold the electricity account with across the premises and sell electricity to the lot owners, and in some instances they'll pay a rebate back to the scheme for that benefit. However, not all parties or third parties operate as retailers, and in this instance those fees that they charge are based on a range of costs. That might be some of the infrastructure charges, based on them owning the meters, owning the solar assets, owning the batteries and the like. And so there also might be financing costs associated to that get passed through as part of their overall fee structure. But it's important to remember that the main infrastructure assets are still owned by the scheme, and the responsibility for that electricity, the quality of that electricity and the continuous supply still sits with the scheme. And that's why it's important for the scheme to understand they still carry a lot of the risk, even though a third party might be utilising the meter assets and the like to control the energy pricing and the billing services.
So generally the perceived problem with the third party arrangement is that the contract that the developer negotiates, at the end of that contract, the third party provider still owns the infrastructure. They might have written down a large portion of it, but it sort of puts the owners of the scheme in a difficult position in that they need to then negotiate with that third party to renew the contract. And if they decide that they don't want to go with that third party, then they may be liable for the additional costs that might come with removing their infrastructure, which could be the hot water system or the air conditioning units, or the metering system, which is generally the case. And then the owners are up for that cost themselves to install their own metering system and plant and equipment. So it can often be a little bit difficult at the end of that period. And usually we will find that the contracts will be around about a 10-year contract, like generally a 5+5. But what we're starting to find is some of these third parties are aware that that's a little bit of a issue now in the market, and we're now seeing that the third parties will write down their investment into the scheme over the 10 years. And so that at the end of that 10-year contract, the owners and the third party are more on an even footing when it comes to negotiating the new contract. So I encourage developers to think about that when they are negotiating with third parties, what would happen at the end of the contract and what position they want to leave their owners in. And also the developer needs to be aware when they're entering into those contracts, some of the particulars that you might find in there around who's liable for maintaining a lot of the infrastructure we've talked about. And the third party will also require licenses over the common property. The developer should really make themselves aware of what those licensed areas will be and make sure it won't interfere with access to other plant and equipment that might not be associated with the third party.
Okay, and Scott, what's changed that's driving so much interest in embedded networks in WA?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question there, Lana, and I guess what it's really coming down to, it's everyone's focus on sustainability. And the biggest challenge, I think, which the strata industry is going to face ever in its history is the introduction of EVs or electrical vehicle chargers into schemes. And that's been driven by people's desire to want to go sustainable, but also, as we've spoken about, increasing energy prices and fuel prices and driving them onto that conversion to EVs. But regardless of whether a scheme wants to start preparing for EVs, the international market's basically going to force them to have to start accommodating EVs, because what we're finding is that car manufacturers are now phasing out combustion engines. So VW are phasing them out in 2025. Europe will be phasing them out by 2035. So what we're going to be left with here in Australia is that if you're going to want to buy a new car, basically 80% of the cars that will be available for you to purchase will be electric vehicles. So schemes won't have a choice. They're going to have to start thinking about accommodating for EVs. Because if they don't, what will happen is that owners can make an application under Section 63 of the Act. And that entitles them to be able to provide a utility for their lot, which would include an EV charger. So they can install the EV charger in their car bay and cable it to their meter. If the schemes don't take ownership of it, effectively all the lots will slowly come along and make that application and start running cabling through the scheme to their meters, and it's going to turn into a spaghetti factory. The other challenge is that a lot of our schemes have actually reached maximum capacity with regards to the supply of electricity throughout the scheme. And so schemes need to be more aware of what their electrical infrastructure is about. And this is one of the things which we're trying to drive with Landgate. We're currently doing a review of the reforms and trying to encourage Landgate to implement a requirement that schemes now really start to look at what their electrical infrastructure is. Not just a 10-year maintenance plan, but they need to start planning on what the maintenance of their scheme will be for the provision of sustainable infrastructure and EV chargers.
Right, the time is now, isn't it? So you've talked about EVs, Scott. What about other sustainable infrastructure?
So that's right. We've spoken about EVs, and EVs is a big element of what's driving this focus now into the electrical infrastructure. But of course, we've always had we've had solar, and the solar challenge is also a big contentious issue in that where a scheme is metered direct or owned by Western Power, each lot can make an application under Section 63 to run the cabling and 64 to install the solar and put the solar on the roof to benefit their lot's consumption or offset their lot's consumption. The challenges of that is in a multi-tiered scheme, there's only so much roof space, and there's nothing in the legislation that controls how much electrical or solar array an owner might make an application for to put on the roof. And we're already seeing it now where you might have a 2-story scheme, 10 apartments, they're all putting in applications for their solar array on the roof, but in the end it just isn't enough roof space to carve up that all the lots can benefit. And I guess that's why we're now really looking at this stepping away from the Western Power meter ownership to an embedded network where the scheme can step in, take ownership of the metering and the provision of electricity to the lots, and actually create some bylaws and a bit of a plan on how they're going to actually be able to accommodate the introduction of EVs, and then how they're going to accommodate solar. And ultimately then, the scheme can put solar on the roof and it will benefit everyone rather than just the individuals.
Okay, so what are the other limitations facing strata schemes?
So from a capacity perspective, in terms of energy available to that scheme or that property, Western Power control that amount. So there's a transformer out the front and that's set to a certain amount of electricity that can be delivered into the premises. So if you're consuming close to that limit already, and that might be older premises that have previously been designed without air conditioning and now they've put split systems in everywhere and they've been chipping away, getting closer and closer to that limit, and that limit will trip the whole site and there'll be no more power. So there are properties that have got that are looking at EV chargers and they want EV chargers, but the reality is it's not available to them. And so they have to come up with solutions. For example, if they are a complete ownership model and they've got that, they have the account with the retailer and they control their solar assets and their battery assets, they can design and configure those to service the EVs, the EV chargers, even though they don't have capacity at the gate meter is what we often call it. So coming up with that strategy, which is a long-term strategy to A, gain control of the assets, B, deploy solar because it's cost effective to do so right now, they can save money, but they're actually provisioning spare capacity behind the gate meter, if you like, for them when EV chargers come, and batteries play a serious role in that in the future as well. Or they can ask Western Power for more electricity.
Yeah, and it's not just the electrical infrastructure that might be a limitation for a scheme. If a scheme wants to put in solar, the solar's gone on the roof. Now, is the roof structure actually capable of supporting a solar array, and how big a solar array could it be able to accommodate? Experience is that don't put solar on a tiled roof. They end up having to cut the tiles or crack, and then you've got the anticon sheeting which all gets pierced, and all of a sudden the whole building is leaking. So I do encourage people not to put solar on a tiled roof, but is it structurally sound? Also, where are you going to put your inverters? You need common areas to be able to put inverters, and if you really want a future provision, where might you install batteries? And this is going to be the biggest conversion which we're going to start to see, probably not immediately right now, but as batteries become more affordable, and as we see more electrical vehicles on the market, we're also going to see a second-hand battery market. And so therefore, under that scenario, if a scheme is looking to put in solar, and they need to think where their inverters are going, where can they then put battery? And if they're going to do battery, think about the second-hand battery market, which will start to emerge over the next 5 to 10 years. And that means the ability to swap the batteries in and out. So don't just look at a little room down in the basement, which is inaccessible, and you set it up for those batteries once off. You need to think about the ability to change the batteries in and out, because I really think there'll be an emerging second-hand battery market as more of us start driving electric vehicles.
And there's probably one more major one, is a lot of the older assets, the electrical infrastructure has reached end of life, or is often beyond its end of life. Yep. So if you want to deploy solar, if you want to install solar, you need to apply to Western Power to get approvals, and they will say yes, but you've got to retrospectively bring all of that infrastructure up to standard, which often triggers a replacement. So that consideration needs to be factored in to the strategy up front, and that should be done in a review process at the beginning.
A lot to consider. So our objective today was to understand how the energy sector works. Damien, can you summarise what we discussed today?
Sure. So look, I suppose the whole reasoning of the word naked truth was to try to sort of outline the various players in the industry, how the energy gets to our premises, and then once it's within our premises, and specifically the strata industry, is what scenarios exist in terms of how energy is bought and paid for, and what impacts that has on individuals and their costs.
And we've also explored what's driving that interest. And a lot of that comes back down to the need for schemes to be a lot more proactive around planning for their electrical infrastructure, understanding what the limitations are, and formulating a strategy about how they're going to be able to manage the future sustainable expectations their owners are going to have with the scheme.
Thanks, guys. So in part 2, we'll explore the opportunities that exist for building owners and for strata schemes to generate an income from the infrastructure they own. And in part 3, we'll delve into the conversion of buildings from where lots are metered direct with Western Power to embedded networks.